This is Duke University.
This is Office Hours at Duke University. Today, Professor Landon Cox takes your questions on approaches to privacy for online social networks. Cox is an assistant professor of computer science here at Duke. He won a National Science Foundation Career Award for his work on computer privacy. His most recent NSF grant is to develop a way to improve security on mobile phones. To ask Professor Cox a question, send an email to live@duke.edu, tweet with the tag Duke Live, or post to the Duke University Facebook page. You can watch today's discussion again anytime on Duke On Demand.
I'm James Todd from Duke's News Office, and I am here with Landon Cox, an assistant professor in Duke's Department of Computer Science. And I should add, it's homecoming weekend here at Duke, and you are also a Duke alumnus. Okay, so privacy in online social networking. There's one name that looms very, very large. That's Facebook, a movie coming out, 500 million users. So what is the Facebook approach to privacy?
Well, so Facebook is a single organization, and they basically control all of their users' data. And in the terms of service, they stipulate that they're allowed to do basically whatever they want with it. They can share it with their partners. They can mine it to give you ads that are better suited to your tastes. And users can restrict how their data is shared with other users and possibly outside of Facebook in some cases. But ultimately, Facebook has control of that data, and they can do whatever they want with it.
So I hear you making an interesting distinction that as a user of Facebook, there's all these controls that are sometimes more simple or more complicated, but that is privacy vis-a-vis other users. It's not privacy vis-a-vis other companies, corporate partners.
Yeah, that's right. So Facebook's controls are pretty sophisticated, and they let you control how you share data with other users at a pretty fine-grained level. But you can express, and sometimes you can opt out of services that allow Facebook to share data with other companies or other partners. But ultimately, Facebook is in control of all that data, and they will decide the best way to handle it.
Okay, and not surprisingly, our first question that's been emailed in is about Facebook. It comes from Victoria, and for privacy reasons, we're not going to use her last name, but she writes, is there any way to not allow my friends of friends to find you on Facebook? And she says, it is my understanding that friends of friends can see my photo and name and can send me messages or ask to be my friend. Is this true? And if so, is there any way around it? Thank you.
Yeah, so Facebook does have these controls for users where they can allow friends or friends of friends or anybody on the internet to access whatever subset of information you put into Facebook. So those controls exist. Sometimes they're a little complex, but there are lots of people who have posted instructions on the web for how to control those settings. So yeah, you can definitely restrict what your friends of friends see.
Okay. Now, interestingly, you just recently got a grant from the National Science Foundation to explore different approaches, different technical architecture to online social networking. Can you talk about what that project is?
Sure. So we really enjoy the service that Facebook provides. It's really central to both my life and my collaborators' lives, and they have 500 million users at this point. But there are certain things that maybe you want to control, and you don't want to give Facebook ultimate control over it. And so the project is really looking at, well, how can you develop data architectures that allow people to have final say over what happens with their data, to not give up final control to some organization like Facebook. And so the grant is basically to explore research for developing those kinds of architectures.
And now when you say decentralized, a name that comes to mind is Napster.
Mm-hmm.
So the online file sharing that was big with MP3s and got shut down, that was illegal. But is that right? Is that an example of decentralized sharing?
Right. So you can think of, so when we say, Facebook is a sort of centralized online social network, what we really mean is it's a single administrative domain. It's a single organization that's in control of all of this data. And the decentralized approach says, well, let's try to make sure that the only people that are in control of the data are the users themselves and maybe their friends that they choose to share it with. And they don't have to worry about somebody coming in behind their backs and sharing it or using their data in a way that they're not comfortable with. So that's kind of the research that we're trying to look at.
Okay. And I want to remind everybody watching that we are participating in social media right now on the Ustream website, and you can send Professor Cox a question and do that by email, live@duke.edu. You can tweet in your question with the tag Duke Live or post on the Duke University Facebook page. Now, Professor Cox, in talking about this alternative architecture to Facebook, it seems like there would be a lot of technical challenges. I mean, you can imagine with Facebook, there's sort of one central server or server farm. All the information goes there and back out. But if you're relying on me to have my computer on in order to share my information, that's not very convenient for someone who wants to see my information, a friend, when I'm not there. So how do you address that?
Right. So that's sort of one of the central engineering challenges is if I'm relying on my friends' PCs to serve my data, well, sometimes they shut them off and sometimes they're not available. So you want to have what we call replicas or backup servers that can also serve the data. And so a big part of our research is understanding, well, how do we coordinate these backups or these backup servers, these replica servers, in such a way that if I want to get to the data that my friend has posted, with very high probability, I can.
Okay. And now, we just mentioned with this webcast that we do, people can do Twitter, they can do Facebook and email, and that's not the end of it. I mean, there's Google Latitude, there's Looped, there's Foursquare. Can you talk about the social media landscape? I mean, who's out there and technically what are they doing?
Right. So I think one of the exciting developments is adding location to social networks. So you mentioned Foursquare, which is a service that's really taken off in the last year or so. And the model with Foursquare is that I am at a place, and through my mobile device, I check into that place, and I basically tell my friends I was at this place at this time. And they give out certain rewards for people who check into certain places a lot of times, like you can become the mayor of a coffee shop. And these games are fun for their users. And right now, I think these services are in their infancy. And I think eventually what you'd like to see is, well, I'm at a certain place, and what is the social context of that place? Are there people nearby that I should know or do know? What are the tastes of the people around me? If I go to a city, for example, and I want to know a bar or a club to visit, where should I go where the people whose tastes match my own congregate? Answering those kinds of questions. So I think these services are just starting to become popular. And of course, the interesting research question is, well, these services are going to be useful and fun to use, but location is a particularly sensitive kind of personal information. And so you want to build these services in such a way that people's location privacy is preserved as well.
Yeah, talk about that, because this is all based on the development of having GPSs and phones, which are really handy when you're lost and you want to get on, do an online map. But, of course, in doing that, you're divulging your location. And so how do you explore that question? Right.
I think there are a couple ways to think about it. And so one is you can try and build a service that so I guess I should back up. A lot of these services are built in such a way that you have a device that knows where you are, and it uses a variety of technologies to figure out where you are. And then it forwards to a central server where that user is. And then the server can coordinate interactions between users based on those locations. So if they know that two people are at the same place at the same time, they can connect them in some way. So that's fine. But we've tried to think about ways of enabling those same kinds of interactions without divulging, for example, the location to the coordinating server, or divulging less information to the coordinating server. So thinking about, can we still provide all the benefits to the end user so they get the same service that they want, but their privacy risks are mitigated in some way.
And are you using some kind of encryption, or technically what's going on there?
Yeah, so in the services we've tried to imagine, we rely heavily on cryptographic techniques to ensure that the server gets some information about what's going on, but not enough to really put your location privacy at risk. So they shouldn't be able to track where you've been over time, for example.
Okay, I got you. And your most recent grant is to explore this idea of building trust between mobile device users. So what's that project?
Right. So the most recent NSF grant is looking at, we have these services, and users are sort of trying to say something about where they are, for example. So in Foursquare, I check into Foursquare, and Foursquare has to believe that I was actually at that place. Otherwise, the service kind of breaks down because anybody could have been anywhere, and there's no real reality to it. Mm-hmm. So part of what we're looking at is trying to allow devices to prove, in a sense, that they actually were in that place, mm-hmm. To a certain extent. Mm-hmm. So that if Foursquare receives a location from a user, they can say, okay, well, they didn't just invent that location. Mm-hmm. Their device actually was at that location.
Mm-hmm. I got you. And so on a mobile phone, we've been talking about GPS, but also phones these days have a camera, mm-hmm. they have a microphone, some have an accelerometer that says how fast you're going. Right. And so that's a lot of information that intuitively you feel like, well, I'm controlling all that, but in fact, the phone, particularly if it's connected online, can be turned on and off. So Big Brother could potentially see what you're seeing, hear what you're hearing, know where you are, and know if you're in a car or on a bike. I mean,
right.
That sounds dangerous.
Well, I think it's always a balance. I mean,
right.
all of those sensors are on your device because you
mm-hmm.
can build really useful and interesting services from those sensors. And I think the right question is the information that is made available through my device being used properly? And so we're trying to build, techniques that allow people to sort of understand where their data is going, and then they can decide whether it's being used appropriately or not.
And so when you run experiments with the mobile devices, how do you set that up? Because it's not the classic, here's the big computer cluster, and I'm going to run a program and see how much CPU it takes up. So how are you doing that, especially to incorporate this kind of social aspect of sometimes my phone is off, sometimes it's on, sometimes I'm on Wi-Fi, sometimes I'm not. How do you experiment with mobile phones?
So it's really difficult. It's really difficult to get code onto real users. Not only because you have to convince them to run the code, but also because there are real privacy issues. I mean, we're interested in privacy, but if I approach somebody and say, hey, please run this code for me, they don't necessarily trust me to do the right thing, right? So there are lots of challenges. And the other thing is we don't necessarily know what the services or popular services are going to behave, how they're going to behave. Mm-hmm. So we're also trying to invent or try to figure out what the popular services will be and then guess what the behavior will be like. So it's actually really, really challenging to figure out how to do experiments in this area. And a lot of our results are sort of analytical results based on the crypto. So we can say, well, based on the properties of these cryptographic algorithms, we know we are exposing this much information to different parts of the system. And then we can do some sort of analysis of worst case. So, okay, well, if they have access to this information, what could they actually do with it? But as far as experimenting with live users, that's very, very difficult.
Would you ever do the way a medical center does and have a clinical trial and enroll
Absolutely,
people?
yeah. So you have to go through IRB, which people in my field are not particularly used to doing. And that in and of itself presents roadblocks. We've been through the IRB process once with one of our experiments, and it was fine. But I think the field as a whole is really going to have to grapple at some point with, well, how do we actually experiment with these kinds of systems?
Gotcha. Professor Cox, we have more than 100 people participating in online office hours. We're talking about privacy in online social network. Everyone watching is invited to get social here and send in a question for Professor Cox. To do that, send an email to live@duke.edu. You can tweet your question with the tag Duke Live or post it on the Duke University Facebook page. Professor Cox, in reading through your research, there's an interesting point that comes up, is that in Facebook, the idea is you're connecting with people that are your friends that you know somehow. But if you contrast that with, say, an eBay, you're interacting with strangers, but you're trying to build up trust with those strangers because they've got that used mountain bike or whatever you mm-hmm. want. Mm-hmm. And you're looking at how can you combine those social relationships and transactional relationships with someone who's a stranger. So how can you tackle those both?
Right. So it's really a question of what the basis for trust is when I interact with somebody online. And in Facebook, you basically have this external information based on like a profile picture or the friends of the person who you think is your friend. That gives you some context about who that person really might be. And then based on your social relationship with them, you trust them to one degree or another. And with eBay, they have reputations. And so you have, people get good marks for having given good service in the past. And those are two, I think, very different approaches to trying to create trust in an online interaction.
Mm-hmm. I got you. Now, we've talked about some of these NSF grants you've got to study online social networking, and one was for about $500,000, a substantial grant, and it actually caught the eye of some members of Congress. And let's just say that not everybody immediately understands why you need $500,000 to study Facebook online social networking. Isn't that for goofing off? So how would you put the value of the research that you do?
Right. So the grant was from the National Science Foundation for 3 years, and it supported 2 graduate students for 3 years. And so it basically comes out to about $150,000 or so, split between the 2 graduate students and myself over 3 years. And the purpose of the grant is to support research and training in computer security and privacy issues. So the results of the grant are, well, you have these students who've been able to continue their graduate work, and they've hopefully done some research that contributes to people's knowledge of how to build privacy-sensitive architectures.
And do you envision social networks, I would say, being used for things other than just socializing? I mean, are there examples, business uses, or I don't know, humanitarian, these kind of things? Yeah,
I mean, I think it's a form of communication that will spread to all aspects of life in the future. It's just a very general purpose service.
In talking about the vision of where this is going, and we were talking about phones and all the data that a phone can collect from an individual person, location, sound, image. You wrote that taking all these data inputs from numerous phones and aggregating them can produce a high-resolution view of the world. Yeah, can you explain about that?
Yeah, so this was that comes from a paper that I worked on with a collaborator of mine, the ECE department here at Duke, Romit Raj Chaudhary, and we're in that paper trying to explore the possibilities. So part of my research is trying to understand the privacy implications, but it's also trying to understand, well, what are the real opportunities? And so that paper was looking at the opportunities, and the thinking was that, well, you have lots of sensors that are on people at all times, and so if you could expose the information that is available from those sensors, it becomes like a telescope, in that you can focus in on a certain region of the world, and maybe you can send queries to the people who are there. Maybe you can access their sensors and learn something about what's going on in that certain part of the world. So it was a nice metaphor that Romit came up with, actually, for what these services are really capable of, what their potential is.
And are there specific examples of that on a small scale you put into practice with your research group to, let's see if we can?
Yeah, so we built a prototype of this particular system. It hasn't been deployed. I mean, it was just a research prototype. But there's work that we've done in this area. There's also lots of work at other universities exploring this idea. One of the most prominent is at UCLA, where they are equipping phones with like environmental sensors. So if they want to know how bad the smog is in certain parts of Los Angeles, they can submit a query. It gets injected into all of these devices, and they get some feedback about what the environmental conditions in the city are. So people are sort of starting to play around with these ideas. I don't know of too many services that are actually deployed. Everything's still in sort of the research phase. But I think you can imagine in the next decade or so that we'll actually be able to use these services in real life.
I got you. And you study professionally online social networking, but I think people are always curious. So do you tweet? Do you use Facebook? How do you actually use these in your own?
Yeah, I use Facebook. I think it's a great tool for communicating with people, keeping in touch with people. I think that's why it's interesting to me, is because I really like using the service. As for Twitter, I basically just use it for read only. I follow other people. I don't tweet. But yeah, I love these services, and I'm excited by their potential. And that's why I think it's important that we get it right so that they don't do damage.
And what about, I mean, we've talked about it some and just raising the issue of privacy, but ethics with technology, I mean, like you're saying, it's powerful to be able to ping somebody's cell phone and know where they are. Do you have those kind of conversations with your colleagues in computer science about this is really neat and cool, but should we do it? I mean, you know, the Google's do no evil mantra. Do you have those kind of conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think those conversations happen in the research community all the time. And if you look at the papers that are published, some of them are looking at the potential, and they say, well, we're not going to deal with privacy. And then there are lots of other researchers who are looking explicitly at privacy. So there's always this conversation between the features that we can enable, and then also the privacy concerns. There's always this tension between the two sides.
Right, and if you got to do a grand experiment, if the IRB, of course they don't do this, but just gave you a free pass and said, go ahead, Professor Cox, design your experiment, what would you do? What would you find out? Mobile phones around the world?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, right now it's actually really hard to get accurate location traces, just to know how people move around the world. And so people who work at phone companies know at a very coarse granularity sort of where people are. And if you collaborate with people at like AT&T, you can kind of look at anonymized traces of where people go. But I think just sort of understanding how people move through the world, that's really useful data, and it's really hard to get. So if I could, I would love to install something on people's phones that would let me sort of generate a sense of how people actually move through the world.
That would be interesting. What do you think you might find out about?
I think it'd be really boring. I think you'd find out that people have regular routines and they rarely deviate from them.
Right. Now you mentioned the technology companies that actually put out devices like iPhones, and you actually collaborate with people in industry, Intel and AT&T Labs and Verizon. So I think there's obviously some good potential there, but talk about that, you know, kind of the pure science notion that you're in academia, but since you work with technology, you're collaborating with people in the corporate world. How does that work?
Well, so I think the people at the industrial labs are top-notch. You know, nobody can question their scientific credentials. They're absolutely the equal of academics. And I think that what's nice about collaborating with people in industrial labs is that they often have perspectives from being closer to the company that maybe we in academia don't have, and so it's really nice to collaborate with them. They're excellent, top-notch scientists, and they do have this different perspective on maybe what's important than we do.
And do you find that sort of interests are aligned? I mean, for corporations, obviously the profit motive is always hanging out there somewhere, even though sometimes these research labs are given a lot of latitude. The individual scientists have a great deal of independence, and the people that I work with, as far as I know, don't feel any pressure from their company to work in a particular area or to pursue certain kinds of results. I mean, they're really involved in the same sort of scientific enterprise that anybody in academia is. I got you. Professor Cox, we have about 200 people participating here in online office hours, and I want to invite everyone watching to ask Professor Cox a question. To do that, you can send an email to live@duke.edu. You can tweet in your question with the tag Duke Live. We've touched on it some, but we were talking about this Foursquare technology that is location dependent. So what are some of these hot new, beyond Facebook and Twitter technologies that are out there? In preparing for this, I learned about Google Latitude for the first time. So what are these technologies doing?
So there are a lot of startups that are trying to figure out what this space is going to look like in the next decade. I think Foursquare is probably the most prominent one with their check-in model. And what you're starting to see is bigger companies adopting those techniques that catch on. So Facebook recently introduced a feature called Places, which lets you check in from a location and broadcast that to your Facebook friends, which in a lot of ways duplicates the functionality of Foursquare. Google Latitude is similar. You can basically post something with a location and then share it with your friends. And so I imagine that what is right now sort of in the startups will eventually become incorporated into larger services.
And I know you've done some research, at least in the past, on the economics of how these networks work, and that's always a thing that, particularly with a startup company, they've got a new cool technology, but then the rubber has to meet the road. Somehow they need to make some money, and we're talking about this research into a decentralized version of online social networking. But of course, Facebook being a corporation and being centralized, then they have money to support all this. So how does the money flow with these online social networks?
So I think that's a really important engineering constraint for the things that we build. So if you want to have something that's decentralized, you don't want it to then cost users a lot of money per month because people are just going to stick with what's free. So the approach that we've tried to take is taking advantage of the infrastructure that's already in place. So using people's desktop machines as servers because they're already there. It's a sunk cost. And so I think that the cost is definitely an important dimension to the problem.
So we mentioned Napster earlier on that was popular for a time and then was shut down, was illegal. Are there examples of ongoing concerns of successful peer-to-peer networks that have made it commercially viable or at least been culturally popular and not cost anything?
Well, so BitTorrent is very popular, and that is free.
You have to say, what is BitTorrent?
So BitTorrent it's a peer-to-peer distribution network. Mm-hmm. People can trade and serve very large files. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of illegal activity that probably goes on mm-hmm. BitTorrent. But so those and really it just relies on the altruism of users to contribute resources. And BitTorrent actually has mechanisms to enforce equal participation in the system. So if I use BitTorrent a lot, then I have to contribute a lot. And so a lot of those techniques came out of work earlier this decade. So you can try and build a sustainable sort of free service using those incentive techniques.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think of Wikipedia, it's not exactly, but these sort of that are peer-to-peer that are sustainable.
Yeah, and then there are also people who just enjoy participating, and they're mm-hmm. going to contribute for free because they enjoy it. And I think Wikipedia is an example of this. Open source software in some ways is like this. People aren't necessarily being paid to contribute their time and effort, but they enjoy it, so they do it.
Mm-hmm. And now you, of course, teach courses here in computer science at Duke, and you are a computer science math major here. Are you seeing a change in what students are interested in or the kinds of undergraduate students that come into computer science because of like a Facebook or an iPhone where it's social, it's cool?
Well, I certainly think that the technologies that students use are more exciting to them when you're trying to help them understand how computer systems work. Mm-hmm. So in the classroom, if you can relate a concept that's very general, a general principle that applies to lots of computer systems to something they actually care about, then they'll learn the material better and they'll be more interested. Enrollments have certainly changed since I was an undergrad. I think they peaked in my graduation year of '99. And enrollments, I think, are starting to come back up a little bit, but certainly not as many people are studying computer science as they were earlier.
I got you. Everyone watching is invited to ask Professor Cox a question. To do that, you can send an email to live@duke.edu. You can tweet your question with the tag Duke Live or post it on the Duke University Facebook page. We started with Facebook, and I want to kind of start to wrap up with Facebook. If you were to write the disclaimer for Facebook, sort of user beware. Obviously, you enjoy it yourself, and you're not advocating against it. But what is the information that you would tell to the average Facebook user about just know that here's how your information is being used?
Yeah, I think it's mostly just awareness. I mean, I think number one, you should be aware of how your data is shared with other Facebook users, and there are tools out there that will, for example, tell you if you're sharing something with the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. I wish I had the website at the tip of my tongue, but I don't. So I think that's the first thing, is just understand what is shared with your friends, understand what's shared with your friends of friends, and then understand what is shared with the web in general. And then I think you have to, if you post something on Facebook, I think you have to be aware that Facebook changes the privacy settings every now and then. And sometimes you can get the privacy settings wrong through a misconfiguration. And so there's a danger either through some misconfiguration of your own or some change in Facebook policy that something could suddenly become available to people that wasn't available before. And so you just have to be aware of that risk.
I gotcha. And there's a Pew Internet study out recently. We're talking about trends in social networking, and you talk about your work in mobile social networking that says that 35% of adults have apps on their phones. And I'm reading here, interestingly enough, 11% of cell phone owners are not sure if their phone has apps. So there's still some adoption going on. But what about this app culture? I mean, what are the questions and concerns that going from Facebook to apps that you would raise?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting development. So really, before the iPhone, there were applications that ran on phones, but it wasn't sort of as big of a deal as it became since the App Store for the iPhone opened up. It didn't attract as many developers or as much attention from users. And so since then, you've really had this explosion of development activity for mobile devices. And people are excited by, again, the kinds of services you can build with the sensors that are on a device, the fact that devices now know where they are if you ask them to figure out where they are. And I think there are interesting privacy questions that come up with this too, because these apps are running on your phone and they have access to information that's potentially sensitive, like where you are. And so I think the question is, well, again, how do we balance what kind of information we expose to these apps and how do we know what they're doing with it once we give it to them? And then also allow people to build and develop really interesting services. I mean, I think that's really key tension.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And as we wrap up here, we should say that you're getting ready to present at a conference in a couple of weeks, the Operating Systems Design and Implementation Conference. And Duke Computer Science, that's cs.duke.edu. You can check out the website and your research there. So as a closing question here, you're a professor and you sometimes give homework assignments. And for everyone watching who's very busy, what about a real easy assignment about what should somebody Google? What should they look up if they're interested in this online social networking world?
So I think if you Google Facebook privacy, you're going to get a ton of hits, and you'll get sort of Facebook's take on their own privacy policies. You can find the history of Facebook's changes to policies, and you'll get people who are sort of pushing back against Facebook. So if you just Google Facebook privacy, you'll get lots of views on the issue.
Yeah, good. Professor Landon Cox, Assistant Professor of Computer Science here at Duke. Thank you for holding these online office hours.
Thanks. It's nice to be here.
Good. A recording of this session will be available along with many other Duke videos on the Duke On Demand website.
Watch Duke
On Demand.
ondemand.duke.edu.
This week on Duke On Demand, a Duke researcher is using DNA to build tiny computer circuits.
The larger goal for this work is to bring computation into new domains. For example, in a drug compound that you've just ingested.
Also this week, a Duke professor uses the new Bull City Connector bus to introduce his students to nonprofit organizations in Durham.
Fall gardening tips from a Duke Gardens horticulturist.
And the new Left of Black webcast show with Mark Anthony Neal presents a contrarian view of African American contemporary culture. ondemand.duke.edu